August 14, 2005, a Boeing 737 from Cyprus climbs into a flawless sky. Minutes later, alarms will sound where they don't belong. Radios will fall silent, and high above Athens, 121 souls will be trapped in a mystery no one on the ground can explain. AIR Shock AI. Subscribe now for real events, eyewitness accounts, and dramatic stories you won't want to miss. It was still early when the first warmth began to rise over Larnaca. The airport's apron shimmered faintly in the morning sun. A Helios Airways Boeing 737-300, painted white and blue, sat at its stand, the tail fin catching the light with each shift of the breeze. Around it, the ground crew moved in a quiet, well-practiced rhythm. A fuel truck hummed nearby, baggage carts rattled across the concrete, and the last cleaning staff stepped down the air stairs, their work done. Inside the terminal, passengers began to cluster at the gate. The air carried the low murmur of conversation, the clink of coffee cups from a nearby kiosk, and the occasional burst of laughter from families excited about their journey. There were parents with children tugging at their hands, couples leaning into each other as they spoke softly, and solitary travelers staring through the large windows at the waiting aircraft. Among the passengers were Paros Dimitriou and Maria Riku, recently engaged. They had booked this trip more than a month ago, a pre-honeymoon escape to the Greek islands. For them, it was meant to be a time of celebration, a memory to begin their married life. On the crew roster for the day, one name had been added at the last minute: Andreas Prodromou, 25 years old. He hadn't been scheduled to work this flight, but his girlfriend, also a flight attendant for Helios, was rostered on this sector. He decided to join, spending the day with her in the skies. Andreas was more than just cabin crew. He held a commercial pilot's license, the first step toward his dream of commanding an aircraft like the one waiting outside. His father had wished he would stay in the family business, but Andreas's heart was set on flying. In the cockpit, Captain Hans Merton, a German contract pilot brought in for the busy summer season, sat in the left seat. Beside him was First Officer Pambos Haralambous, a Cypriot pilot who had been with Helios for 5 years. Their voices were low and steady as they moved through the pre-flight checks, a ritual of switches, dials, and cross-checks repeated hundreds of times before, but never skipped. Every flap setting, fuel quantity, and hydraulic reading had its place in the sequence. The cabin filled slowly. Overhead bins closed with a series of muffled thuds. Safety announcements rolled from the speakers, reminding passengers to fasten seatbelts and locate the nearest exit. Helios was a no-frills carrier. There would be no in-flight meal, but the flight was short and the fare affordable. At 9:07 a.m., the Boeing 737 pushed back, taxied to the runway, and accelerated into the bright Mediterranean light. The nose lifted, the ground fell away, and the climb began. Over the radio, Helios 522, request flight level 340. The reply was prompt. Helios 522, cleared flight level 340. The first few minutes were uneventful until they weren't. A chime cut through the cockpit. The takeoff configuration warning. This was a sound meant only for the ground, to alert pilots if the aircraft was improperly set for departure. At altitude, it had no business being heard. Captain Merton pressed the transmit button. "This is Flight 522, over. Flight 522, what can I do for you? We have a takeoff config warning on." The ground engineer's voice was calm. "I'm sure it's nothing. Let me know when you level off." Before the first mystery could be resolved, a second alarm joined the first, the master caution. This was a catch-all alert, an amber light and tone that could indicate dozens of potential issues, from overheating electronics to pressurization problems. In the cabin, passengers were still settling in when the oxygen masks fell from the overhead panels with a metallic snap. The bright yellow cups dangled on thin tubes, swinging gently. Some passengers gasped. Others instinctively reached for them. Flight attendants moved quickly, securing their own masks before assisting those nearby. The protocol was clear. In a sudden loss of cabin pressure, protect yourself first. Then help passengers if it can be done without moving too far from your oxygen source. What the passengers couldn't know and the cockpit crew hadn't realized was that the air inside the aircraft was already thinning. Every breath contained less oxygen than the one before. Hypoxia doesn't announce itself with pain. It arrives quietly, clouding thought, slowing reactions, and if left unchecked, taking consciousness away altogether. Comment question. You're sitting in your seat, and without warning, the oxygen mask drops in front of you. No announcement from the cockpit. No sudden dive toward a lower altitude. What's your very first move and why? Write it in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily, its nose pointed toward the assigned cruising altitude. The Mediterranean below shimmered in the morning light, calm and endless. But in the cockpit, the atmosphere was shifting. The takeoff configuration warning still chimed, an unwelcome echo in a place where it didn't belong. Captain Merton kept the radio link open to Helios operations in Larnaca. "We have a takeoff config warning on," he repeated. The ground engineer's voice crackled faintly through static. "Understood. Keep me updated when you level off." Then the second alert, the master caution, pulsed amber across the overhead panel. It was a signal that could mean many things: overheating avionics, hydraulic trouble, or pressurization issues. But in their narrowing mental focus, the two pilots saw only one possibility: something wrong with the equipment cooling system. "Both my equipment cooling lights are off," Merton said. "That's normal," replied the engineer. "Confirm your pressurization panel is set to auto." It was a lifeline question, one that could have exposed the real emergency. But the captain didn't check. Instead he asked, "Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" This was hypoxia at work, the invisible thief in the cabin. Thought processes slowed, priorities warped. The oxygen in their blood was dropping with each passing minute. In the passenger cabin, the yellow masks swung gently. The hiss of the chemical generators filled the air, a sound that grew quieter as the minutes passed. Those generators were designed for only 12 minutes of oxygen, enough time for the pilots to descend to a safe altitude. But no descent came. Parents adjusted masks on their children's faces, tightening straps with fumbling hands. Some passengers tried to peer toward the cockpit door, waiting for an announcement. Flight attendants stayed near their stations, their own masks secure, glancing at each other for clues the passengers couldn't see. The climb continued past 14, 0 feet, then 18, 0. The outside air pressure dropped further. In the cockpit, the crew still spoke to the engineer, but the exchanges grew less coherent. Words slurred slightly, pauses lengthened. The engineer on the ground struggled to piece together what was happening above the Aegean. And then, silence. The last exchange ended without warning. When the ground controller tried to re-establish contact, there was no answer. "Helios 522, do you read?" Static. The handover to Athens control went through, but their calls were met with the same emptiness. Helios 522, Athens control. Do you read? Nothing. Inside the control rooms, a thought began to take shape, quiet at first, then shared aloud. Could this be a hijacking? The Greek Air Force was alerted. At Suda Bay, 2 F-16 fighters were scrambled, their afterburners lighting the morning sky. The pilots were briefed quickly. An inbound airliner, unresponsive, on course for Athens. Intercept and investigate. Minutes later, the fighter jets closed in. From the lead F-16, the Boeing appeared serene, sunlight glinting off its fuselage, engines turning smoothly. But as the fighter slid up alongside, the view into the cockpit told another story. The co-pilot's seat was occupied, but the man inside was slumped over the controls, unmoving. The captain's seat was empty. Athena 8cc, there is one figure in the cockpit of Helios 522, the F-16 pilot reported. He appears non-responsive. A slow, controlled pass along the fuselage revealed more. Inside the passenger cabin, figures sat upright in their seats, masks hanging, heads still. Not one turned toward the fighter jet, flying just meters away. Then, movement. The F-16 pilot saw someone enter the cockpit, but not in uniform. This was no pilot. It was a man in a cabin crew shirt. He sat in the captain's seat, adjusting himself over the controls. The fighters stayed close, watching every detail. The Boeing began a gentle left turn, descending, comment question. Imagine you're in that F-16 pilot's seat, looking through the cockpit window of a passenger jet, and you see the crew unresponsive. The aircraft is heading toward a city. What's your next move? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious how you'd decide in those seconds. The 2 F-16s held their position, close enough to see the streaks of dust and insects on the 737's cockpit glass. The Mediterranean lay far behind now. Below them stretched the rugged hills and scattered villages of Attica. The sun was high, the sky a flawless blue, the kind of day pilots dream of. But in this sky, something was wrong. From the lead fighter's seat, the pilot could see into the Boeing's cockpit. The co-pilot's chair was occupied by a man slumped forward, his head bowed over the controls, unmoving. The captain's seat was empty. Instruments still glowed in the shadows of the panel, the autopilot keeping the jet on its silent course. Athena 8cc. There is one figure in the cockpit of Helios 522. He radioed back to Athens control. He appears non-responsive. The wingman peeled away slightly, lining up with the passenger windows. The view was worse than expected. Rows of still bodies, some with masks hanging loosely over their faces, others with masks dangling untouched. No one turned toward the fighter. No one lifted a hand in recognition. Inside the air traffic control rooms, voices stayed low but tense. The controllers had seen strange situations before: radio failures, medical emergencies, but never this. A jet circling a major city with no response from its crew and no sign of life in the cabin. In the fighter pilot's mind, a darker possibility began to take shape. If this aircraft is under someone's control, where will they take it? The city of Athens lay just minutes away. More than 3 million people lived there. Military protocol was clear. If a hijacking was underway, and if the aircraft posed a threat to the city, a decision would have to be made fast. The F-16s adjusted their formation. One stayed level with the cockpit, the other dropped back into what pilots called the weapons position. It was not a stance they took lightly. The decision to fire was not theirs alone, but their readiness was part of the unspoken choreography. Then, a flicker of movement in the cockpit. Someone entered from the cabin, not a pilot in uniform, but a man in a Helios Airways cabin crew shirt. He slid into the captain's seat, strapped in, and reached for the controls. The fighter pilot could see his lips moving, his head turning slightly toward the radio panel, but no voice came through on any frequency. Later, investigators would find the reason. The radio was still tuned to Larnaca, hundreds of kilometers away, where no one was listening anymore. The Boeing began to change its behavior. A gentle bank to the left, a slow descent. The F-16s stayed tight on its wings. Then, a telltale cough from the left engine, a puff of exhaust, the fan blades slowing, fuel starvation. The cabin crewman, later identified as Andreas Prodromou, fought to keep control. But minutes later, the right engine failed as well. The 737 became a glider, descending steadily toward the hills. The F-16 pilots could only watch. There was no altitude left for long-range maneuvers, no power to reach the airport. The man in the cockpit adjusted the yoke, scanning the terrain ahead, dry hills, sparse vegetation, and scattered buildings. The glide angle was unforgiving. At 12:03 p.m., after nearly 3 hours in the air, Helios Airways Flight 522 struck the slope of a hill near the village of Grammatiko. The sound reached the fighters a moment later, a muffled, hollow thud, followed by a burst of flame and a column of smoke curling upward into the midday sky. From above, the scene was chaos, frozen in time. Twisted fragments of fuselage scattered down the hillside, blackened earth, pockets of burning debris. No movement, no signs of survival. The radio from Athens control broke the silence in the fighters' helmets. Helios 522 is down. Repeat, Helios 522 is down. And high above the smoking hillside, the fighters banked away, leaving behind a mystery that, in that moment, had no answers, only the chilling certainty that an entire aircraft crew and passengers alike had vanished into silence long before it hit the ground. Comment question. You're in that cockpit, no fuel, no engines, no working radio, the ground rushing up toward you. Do you aim for a crash landing in open terrain, or try to reach the sea? Share your decision and why in the comments. I want to hear your reasoning. The first reports came in as short, clipped bursts over the radio. Impact confirmed, smoke visible from the main road, no signs of survivors. On the hill north of Athens, the August air shimmered with heat. From a distance, the rising smoke was a thin grey pillar against the cloudless sky. But as rescue teams closed in, the full weight of the disaster revealed itself. The slope was littered with torn metal, some pieces no larger than a suitcase, others the size of a small car. Sections of wing lay twisted in the dust. The fuselage was broken into countless fragments, many blackened from fire. Amid the wreckage, there was silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Fire crews moved quickly, spraying the dry grass to keep the flames from spreading. The smell was a mix of burning fuel, scorched earth, and something heavier, the scent no rescuer ever forgets. In Athens, news of the crash hit the Helios Airways Operations Center like a shockwave. Lazaros Temesian, a flight attendant for the airline, had been on duty when the alerts came in. He recalled later, "It was the most chaotic scene I've ever seen. Our operations controller, he had just lost the aircraft, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. Helios was a small airline, just 3 jets in its fleet. Most of the cabin crew had worked together for years. For some, the crash was not just a professional tragedy, it was personal. One flight attendant, Paul Simeonides, had spent the worst 30 minutes of his life waiting to learn if his fiancée, also a Helios crew member, had been on the doomed flight. Everyone I knew was calling me, asking if I was alive, if she was alive, what had happened. Families in Cyprus and Greece turned on televisions, switched on radios, made phone calls, anything to get a piece of news. At first, there was confusion. The flight was only supposed to take 90 minutes from Larnaca to Athens. How could it have been in the air for 3 hours? Was there another aircraft involved? For Andreas Prodromou's father, the news came with a sickening twist. He hadn't known his son was working that morning. Andreas had been called in at the last minute to fill a spot. I called his phone. He always had it on, but this time there was no answer. After that call, I felt as if the ground was pulled from under my feet. In the streets of Athens, people stopped in their tracks as the first images appeared on television. A hillside burning under the midday sun, rescue workers picking their way through wreckage. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotors sending up dust and ash. Back at the crash site, the grim reality became clear. There were no survivors. The coroner's teams began the painstaking process of recovering bodies and personal effects. Many of the victims were from Cyprus. The small island nation declared 3 days of mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Reporters gathered at the edges of the cordon, their cameras catching glimpses of rescue workers carrying stretchers draped in white sheets. The air was thick with heat and grief. Even for veteran investigators, the sight was haunting. One recalled climbing over a ridge and seeing it for the first time. It was beyond description. The ground was black, burning, pieces of the airplane everywhere. It was terrible, just terrible. Some of the debris still smoldered. Personal items, a child's shoe, a watch, a crumpled boarding pass lay scattered among the wreckage, silent witnesses to the final moments of Flight 522. As the fires were brought under control, the first pieces of evidence were gathered. Charred metal panels, sections of wiring, parts of the cockpit. Somewhere in that tangle lay the keys to understanding what had happened in the sky that morning. But for now, one fact was clear. Whatever had unfolded aboard Helios Airways Flight 522, it had trapped 121 people in a silent, helpless flight to their deaths. And no one, on the ground or in the air, had been able to stop it. Comment question. If you were an investigator arriving at this crash site with so little left intact, where would you begin your search for answers? Share your thoughts below. I'm curious to see your investigative instincts. They reached the hillside with method, not haste. Fire lines were marked. A path was taped through thorn and ash. Investigators moved slowly, gloved hands lifting and setting down fragments as if each one could still bruise. The first hours after a crash are always a negotiation with chaos. Tag what you can, protect what you must, and resist the urge to jump to answers that feel tidy too soon. They looked for the recorders. Everyone does. The bright orange boxes are built to be found, to speak when nothing else can. The cockpit voice recorder housing turned up first, battered and scorched, lodged in a fold of earth like a spent shell. Hope rose a notch, then dipped when they realized the recorder module itself had torn free. For a day, it was a ghost somewhere in the field of wreckage. When they finally found it, the casing was scuffed, connectors bent, but the memory inside still had a story to tell. Across town, the coroner's teams began their grim work. The early toxicology reports cut through one rumor and hardened another. There was no sign of toxins, no mid-air explosion, no smoke inhalation as cause of death. The conclusion was cold and clarifying. Everyone on board was alive at impact. Whatever had emptied the airplane of movement and voice had not killed. It had silenced. The end came only when Earth rose to meet aluminum. Back at the site, they raised larger questions from smaller clues. The flaps were recovered in a position consistent with cruise. The landing gear assemblies showed no sign of having been selected down. Fragments of the pressurization ducting were scorched but intact. There was no obvious hole in the fuselage that would explain an explosive decompression. The engines told a different, simpler tale. Signs consistent with fuel starvation. If the flight was planned for roughly 90 minutes, why had it been aloft nearly 3 hours? The math was merciless. Whatever happened in the sky kept the airplane circling far past its fuel window. As data trickled in, people brought their memories. A Helios flight attendant, Lazaros Temesian, remembered another day, less than a year earlier, on this very airframe. A sudden bang, a metallic shudder, oxygen masks falling, and later, a discovery that the aft service door wasn't fully seated, hinges displaced just enough that you could slide a hand through. No injuries that time. An immediate descent, a landing, a fix. In the cabin logbooks, investigators saw a second story. Frequent write-ups, small systems waiting long for parts. Maintenance deferred in that way. Small airlines sometimes normalize when budgets and schedules squeeze. The CVR was flown to a lab. When its audio finally unspooled in headphones, the last minutes were quiet, except for the wind of descent, the chime of warnings, and a voice not a captain's calling Mayday 5 times. The words went unanswered. Later, they would discover why. The radios remained tuned to a frequency hundreds of miles behind them. In those final moments, Andreas Prodromou was not silent, he was unheard. With the voice recorder whispering fragments, attention shifted to habit and hardware. The investigators walked backward through the morning. The aircraft arrived after midnight from a previous sector. The cabin crew reported banging noises and even icing on the aft service door. Engineers met the aircraft. To test for leaks without starting the engines, they used the APU and ran a pressurization check, a standard sensible step. To do that on a Boeing 737, you reach for a small island of switches overhead, the 5 pressurization panel. You move the auto, MAN selector, to manual. You watch the gauges, listen to airflow, inspect for leaks. When you're satisfied, you move the selector back to auto. That last motion is small. It takes less than a second. On some mornings, with a glare line across the glass and a clock ticking down to departure, people are human. In the wreckage, they found the 5 panel. Photos were taken before anything moved, fingerprints metaphorically dusted. The selector sat in manual. Investigators asked the maintenance crew to tell the story again. Yes, the test had been run. Yes, the selector had been set to manual, to pressurize with the APU. Was it returned to auto? Memory reached for certainty, then stumbled. Procedure said it should have been. The metal said otherwise. They mapped that tiny oversight forward in time. If the selector stayed in manual, the cabin would not automatically pressurize after takeoff. As the aircraft climbed, cabin altitude would climb with it. Somewhere after 10,000 feet, an aural chime would sound the same tone used to warn of a takeoff configuration error. It was a design decision from another era, long accepted and rarely a problem until a rare failure intersected with a familiar sound. In a bright cockpit with time pressure, how easy would it be to hear the chime you've trained to think of as config and miss the one you almost never encounter, pressurization? The master caution that followed could be read as equipment cooling trouble. That too can be a side effect of the same root cause. Sensors in the avionics bay don't like the wrong pressure either. Now layer on hypoxia, slower cognition, fixation, a tendency to chase the most salient warning rather than the most fundamental one. The ground engineer, hearing pieces of a puzzle through static and a thick accent, asked the right question: confirm pressurization auto? But the answer seemed to drift past it. Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers? The captain asked instead, a clue to the fog settling over the flight deck. Meanwhile, in the cabin, procedure kept people alive for a while. The drop-down masks, fed by chemical generators, gave passengers about 12 minutes of oxygen time, bought on the assumption that the pilots would race the jet down to thick air. But there was no race. And when the generators exhausted themselves, those without portable bottles would slip from confusion to sleep. For the cabin crew, there were 4 portable oxygen bottles aboard. At the site, investigators found 3 had been used. The picture sharpened. Someone had moved through the cabin after the generators quit. Someone who still had air. DNA swabs added their own quiet confirmations. On a cockpit oxygen mask, investigators found traces that matched the first officer and, in places, indications that the mask had been handled by someone else. The keypad tones, captured on the CVR just before the door opened, matched the sequence required to unlock the cockpit. Each small finding reached toward the same silhouette. Andreas, forcing his way into a silent flight deck, trying to wake pilots whose masks had never auto-deployed, trying to stitch together a situation unraveling by the minute. In meetings that stretched late into the evening, the team began to plan something unusual. A reenactment flight. You don't charter a jet and crew lightly to test a theory. But this accident refused to settle for less. They wanted to know what the warning sounded like in the ear and looked like to the eye when the morning sun poured across the panel. They wanted to feel the way thinking narrows when oxygen thins, to watch how quickly a cascade of small things becomes a trap. Before they flew that test, they drafted a ladder of questions to climb. If the selector is left in manual, how soon does the oral alert trigger? In that light, at that time of day, how obvious is the tiny manual enunciation? How does the master caution tree present? And where does it lead attention? How long until useful consciousness erodes in the cockpit if no one dons oxygen? With no flight crew effectively in command, what does the autopilot do over Athens? It was not one big cause but a chain, a switch left in the wrong position, an oral warning doing double duty, human physiology asserting itself in thin air, and a company culture stretched thin by busy seasons and small fleets. The tragedy wasn't theatrical, it was procedural, and that made it harder, because procedural faults are the ones that ask for humility. How many times have we all trusted that the last small step was done because it should have been? Night settled over Athens as the investigators closed their notebooks for the day. On a hillside north of the city, an impromptu shrine had already begun photos of loved ones propped against stones, flowers wilting in the heat, candles guttering in the evening breeze. The faces looked outward, toward a sky that had been perfect, and toward an answer that was forming piece by piece. Comment question. When a disaster grows from small human oversights and familiar warning tones, what single design or training change would you mandate first? Distinct audio for pressurization versus takeoff config. A hard dual check on the auto MAN selector after maintenance, or something else. Write your fix in the comments and tell us why it would have changed this day. 4 months after the hillside went quiet, a 737 lifted off from Athens in the pale morning light. This one belonged to Olympic Airlines, but for a day it would wear the shadow of another flight, Helios 522. In the right-hand seat sat a test captain. In the jump seat, Chief Investigator Akrivos Tsolakis, watching everything. The mission was deliberate. Retrace the doomed path under the same conditions. See what the crew of 522 had seen, hear what they had heard. Before departure, a mechanic reached overhead and, just as had been done on the Helios jet, switched the pressurization selector to manual. A small green light glowed easy to miss in the glare. They left it there. The flight rolled down the runway, lifted off, and began its climb over the Aegean. At 10,0 feet, the first chime cut through the cockpit. To anyone trained in the Boeing 737 symphony of alerts, it was unmistakable, or so it seemed, the tone used for takeoff configuration warning. In reality, it was the cabin altitude warning. The sound was identical. No distinct pitch, no different cadence, nothing to hint that the air in the cabin was thinning. Tsolakis leaned forward. "See?" he said quietly to the others. "This is what they heard." The test pilots nodded, eyes flicking to the annunciator panel. At 16,0 feet, the master caution light illuminated, tied to a fault in equipment cooling. The avionics bay sensors were reacting to the wrong pressure exactly as they had on 522. Again, the pilots followed the branch of logic that fault suggested, and again, pressurization wasn't the first thing in their crosshairs. The air grew thin. Even knowing what was happening, the crew began to feel it. Ears popping, mild lightheadedness, the faint intoxication of hypoxia. Tsolakis recognized it from his own high-altitude chamber training, a creeping loss of clarity. You don't notice your thoughts are slowing until they're already behind you. They pushed higher. The cabin climbed past 18,0 feet equivalent. A mild headache settled in, coordination dulled. The captain, playing the role of Merton, kept scanning until the edges of vision began to grey. In the Helios cockpit, without immediate oxygen, that stage would have been the threshold of unconsciousness. Meanwhile, the autopilot carried on. Over Athens, they let it fly the holding pattern programmed for arrival. It circled, patient and precise, just as the real 522 had, waiting for instructions that would never come. For the final act of the reenactment, they brought in a Hellenic Air Force F-16. Its pilot eased alongside, exactly as on that August day, and looked into the cockpit. In the left seat sat a man in flight attendant uniform, one of the investigators standing in for Andreas Prodromou. The F-16 pilot later confirmed the scene matched his memory of the actual accident. A lone figure in the cockpit, headset on, hands on the controls, trying to fly a machine meant for two. They also tested the cockpit door keypad. The sequence of tones was identical to those captured on the CVR before Andreas re-entered the cockpit in the final minutes. Small sounds, but now stitched into the broader picture. When the reenactment ended and the 737 returned to Athens, the evidence had teeth. It proved the theory, the warning tone's ambiguity, the selector's position, the cognitive chokehold of hypoxia, and the autopilot's unflinching loops over the city. This was no act of terror. It was a chain of oversights and misinterpretations that even seasoned professionals could stumble into. The official report, still in draft at that time, began to write itself. A maintenance procedure left incomplete. A cockpit crew misled by a familiar sound. No oxygen masks in place when they were needed most. And no one on board able to break the sequence in time. Yet one gap remained. Why was Andreas Prodromou the last one standing? And in those final minutes, with fuel dwindling, what exactly happened in the cockpit before Grammatiko Hill came into view? Those answers would take more interviews, more forensic work, and perhaps more imagination than any checklist could provide. Comment question: if you were designing a cockpit alert system today, would you make every critical alarm unique in sound, or could that cause confusion in its own way? How would you make sure a warning like loss of cabin pressure could never be mistaken for anything else? In the hush that follows panic, a different kind of resolve takes root. Somewhere behind the forward galley curtain, with the passenger generators fading and the cabin so quiet you could hear the soft rasp of fabric against armrests, Andreas Prodromou made a decision. He unclipped, reached for a portable oxygen bottle, and started forward, not rushing, because rushing burns air, but steady, one hand to the seatbacks, like a climber crossing an ice field. Flight attendants sometimes call it monkey swinging, mask on, bottle slung, fingers traveling from headrest to headrest, to keep balance when the world tilts. He would have known the limits. He was a certified pilot, trained enough to read an airplane's rhythm. He would have counted, if not in seconds then in instinct, 12 minutes for passengers, much longer on bottled oxygen if you don't waste breath. Looking up the aisle, he saw faces slack, eyes glassy, masks crooked or fallen. Hypoxia doesn't look dramatic. It looks like heavy sleep in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the cockpit door, he tried the obvious. First, knuckles against the laminate. A good rap. The word "Captain" through the mask. Then louder still. Nothing. In most emergencies, the door is a boundary that protects. In this one, it was a dam holding back the only chance left. Andreas punched the keypad code. Inside the CVR, years later, technicians would listen to tiny tones, beep, pause, beep, beep, exactly the pattern he pressed with gloved fingers. The door yielded. Inside, the world narrowed to amber lights, dull chimes, and two motionless men. The first officer was there, slumped forward, his headset askew. The captain's seat was empty. Maybe he'd stood to reach the circuit breakers behind his chair and never made it back. Andreas moved with care. Sit the first officer, upright enough to clear the yoke, pull the quick-don oxygen mask, tug the straps, squeeze the test valve to feel flow. There is a way a living head resists your hands and a way a sleeping one does not. He would have known the difference. If there was breath, it was shallow. If there was pulse, it was thin. Next, radios. The overhead panel, the pedestal common, COM2, audio selector. A cockpit meant for two always assumes two, and he was one. He keyed the mic anyway. Mayday, mayday, mayday. The tape would later count 5 of them. None reached the right ears. The frequency was still Larnaca, far behind them. Miles and miles of air and terrain between those words and anyone who could answer. Outside the glass, The sky was a merciless blue. Below, the airplane was drawing patient circles in a holding pattern that neither pilot had commanded. The autopilot did what it was trained to do. Stay aloft, stay tidy, wait. In that waiting, fuel evaporated into time. Somewhere in that circuit, the first real jolt arrived. A hiccup from the left engine, then a spool down. The sound doesn't vanish. It thins like a fan winding to silence. The airplane drifted left, just a degree or two, enough to make Andreas's shoulders register the change. He reached for the yoke, trimmed, steadied. A few minutes later, the right engine followed. Now, the 737 was a quiet, heavy glider. Its life measured not in hours of fuel, but in feet of altitude, and the lift still left in the wings. The F-16 outside the window slid closer, the pilot inside raising a hand, then flattening it, then pointing gestures older than radios. "Follow me. Descend." Andreas nodded. Or maybe he only thought he did. He tried the mic once more. Mayday. The cockpit was a fistful of tasks he'd seen in manuals and lived in simulators. Never like this, never alone, never with the radio whispering into a void. He had choices, but not many. The nearest airport was within reach for a powered airplane with time to set up, run checklists, throw levers in sequence. He had gravity, a cockpit he knew but didn't own, and a body that had been rationing oxygen for far too long. He could try to stretch the glide toward flat ground, avoid towns, square the wings just before the earth rose. But gliding a 60-ton jet without engines is the work of both hands, both heads, and more air than he had left in the bottle. There is a moment in every dwindling flight when the airplane stops feeling like a machine you command and starts feeling like a fact you negotiate. He trimmed again, small rolls, small corrections. He checked the standby instruments, because when power bleeds, you trust the old needles more than glowing screens. The terrain ahead wasn't generous. Ridges, scrub, fractured lines of dry stone. The F-16 tucked alongside, the pilot's visor turning eyes on eyes, as if will alone could fill a fuel tank. People often imagine heroism as a roar. In cockpits, it's quieter breath management, checklist fragments whispered to yourself. The discipline not to yank at a control because panic wants a gesture. He tried the APU start because a little electrical life could slow a cascade. He scanned the flap lever and gear handle, weighing drag against control. Flaps help you land, they don't help you arrive. Clean wings keep you aloft the longest. He left them where they were. Below them, the Grammatiko hills rose with indifferent patience. The glide angle was what it was. Even perfection has a geometry you cannot charm. The CVR hears breath. A click, the soft whine of air over metal. The F-16 wingman slid to the side, still there, still asking with hands and wings, "Can you see me? Can you follow?" Perhaps Andreas lifted his palm in answer. Perhaps he only meant to. Impact is not one moment, but many that compress. The first touch a scrape, a buckle, then fracture, then fire. The hill held what it was given and gave nothing back. Above, the fighters banked and called it in, with voices that tried to stay flat and failed. What remains after the physics is the human shape of the last minutes. Here is a young man who should not have been working, who carried a pilot's license like a promise to his future self, who found himself alone in a cockpit designed to be flown by two, whose oxygen was a number ticking downward. He did not stop. He unlocked a door, he moved bodies, he found a mask, he keyed a mic, he trimmed a glider, he aimed for the least bad patch of earth he could see. He lost to math and altitude, not to fear. Afterward, on a hill north of Athens, people brought photographs in plastic sleeves and flowers in bottles of water. In Cyprus, families stood by graves, where two lovers, Andreas and Haris, were laid side by side. The official report would speak in careful paragraphs about selectors and tones, SOPs, and training, organizational factors, and human performance. All of that matters. But in the campfire quiet, where stories are told to be understood, one thread glows brighter. When almost everything that should have saved them failed, one person tried anyway. And the lesson that belongs to the living is not just about alarms or switches, it's about layers. Maintenance that ends with a hard verbal cross-check. Flight decks, where pressurization warnings sound unlike anything else. Crews drilled not only to recognize hypoxia, but to treat it first before troubleshooting. It's about designing systems that expect distraction, that forgive a single miss, that shout the right thing in the right voice at the right time. The night after the report came out, someone lit a candle at the Grammatiko memorial and watched the flame bend in a hillside breeze. In that small light was a kind of answer, not enough to undo a day, but enough to mark a promise that the next crew who hears an impossible chime in a bright cockpit will know exactly which breath to take next. Comment question. You're alone in that cockpit with a dwindling bottle and a silent radio. What 3 actions do you prioritize: oxygen, radio, flight path, configuration, and in what order? Write your sequence in the comments and explain why. Thank you for watching this story. Every event, every voice, every name shared, so they remain in memory. If you found this video meaningful, please support us by subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you real events and human stories like this. AIR. Shock AI is with you.